A year of genocide in Gaza. 1 year of unrelenting Israeli bombardment, resulting in the deadliest conflict of the 21st century. It has been a war of many firsts, breaking records in scale and brutality. 41,788 Palestinians have been killed, men, women, the elderly. But those paying the heaviest price have been children, who make up nearly half the Strip's population. In 1 year, Israeli attacks have killed 16,795 children. That's the highest death toll for children recorded in a single year of conflict over the past 2 decades. Even surviving has come at a cost. More than 19,000 children have lost one or both of their parents, often other relatives too. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, entire families have been wiped off the civil registry. Killed, orphaned, also maimed. The UN estimates 1,000 children in Gaza have lost at least one limb, making up what is believed to be the biggest cohort of pediatric amputees in history. Israel has also targeted an unlikely group in its war: health workers. From doctors to nurses to paramedics, they've been arrested and tortured, and more than 800 have been killed. This has also been the worst conflict in recent memory for journalists. 174 media workers have been killed. And unlike most wars, the people of Gaza have had nowhere to go. They are unable to leave, relegated to areas the Israeli military has declared as so-called safe zones, but then bombed repeatedly. There is no safe place in Gaza, a line that was repeated over and over again by Palestinians we spoke to, 90% of whom have been displaced, with some having to move many times. Weapons have not been the only tool in this war. There's starvation as well. The United Nations says Israel has blocked the entry of 83% of food aid into the Strip since the war began. About 96% of the population is facing acute food insecurity. Many children have died of starvation. No one and nothing has been spared. More than 75% of Gaza's infrastructure has been destroyed. That's hospitals, schools, universities, mosques, and churches gone. What remains are these apocalyptic scenes of broken lives and shattered futures. This is Al Jazeera's special coverage of the genocide in Gaza 1 year on. We begin with Hind Khudari's report from Deir al-Balah.
This kitchen is barely recognizable, but there's humanity here among the rubble. But this war has taken so much from so many. This mother says her heart is gone after her twins were killed in an Israeli strike. This father's home was bombed while he was collecting the birth certificates for his newborn twins. On the same day, he received their death certificates. The International Court of Justice recently found it plausible that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Israel has also been criticized for its indiscriminate use of large weapons, including its US-made 900-kilogram bomb that can send lethal fragments nearly 400 meters away. But Israel's destruction of Gaza didn't start in 2023. It has been happening for years. In 2008, the human rights group Pyramid reported that Israel dropped around 1 million kilograms of munitions on the Strip, killing nearly 1,400 Palestinians. That followed rocket fire from Hamas. Israel has also used white phosphorus, a chemical that burns intensely on contact with air, leading to widespread fires and injuries. Human rights group called it a rain of fire. Towards the end of 2012, Israel began a war that would last more than a week and kill 174 Palestinians. Then 2 years later, Israel launched a nearly 2-month offensive in Gaza, killing more than 2,000 Palestinians after the kidnapping and killing of 3 Israeli teens in the occupied West Bank. 3 years ago, Israel went to war again, this time targeting Gaza's buildings, roads, homes, and leveling at least 4 high-rise towers. This included the deliberate targeting of a building housing the offices of Al Jazeera and the Associated Press, among others. Israel has not only waged multiple wars on Gaza in the past several years under the pretext of fighting Hamas and other groups, but it has also quashed non-violent resistance. In 2018, the so-called Great March of Return demonstrations demanded an end to the Israeli blockade and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Just holding banners at Israel's separation fence would prove lethal, as Israel attacked with tear gas, then live bullets and munitions. Even between wars, the Israeli military kept up its operations. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has referred to these tactics as mowing the lawn, a strategy of periodic bombings aimed at Palestinian towns and cities.
The latest war has been the most devastating. Israel has failed in its objective to destroy Hamas, while Gaza lies in ruins. And despite the clear evidence presented by UN agencies forming the basis for war crimes, prosecutions, and condemnation by international courts, the genocide continues unabated. Hind al-Khudari, Al Jazeera, Gaza, Palestine.
Israel's war has changed life in Gaza beyond recognition. Palestinians say that they're exhausted after a year of suffering. We spoke to some of them, and here's what they told us.
زهقنا وتعبنا من الحرب.
احنا راحت علينا منهج صف 9 و10 تعبنا بس بدنا ايقاف الحرب.
ربنا سبحانه وتعالى يعني يوقفها علينا ونرجع على بلادنا سالمين لأنه الشعب كله تعب.
الحرب دمار، الحرب هلاك، الحرب إبادة جماعية تمت بيننا، أهلي راحوا، حبايبي راحوا، ما ضلش إلا أنا.
هذه مش حرب، هذا دمار وإبادة للشعب الفلسطيني.
تعتبر هذه الحرب ظالمة، موحشة، قاهرة، فاقدة لجميع الأشياء، البيت، العائلة، الأصدقاء.
التشتت بجميع أنواعه، الحرمان، الفقر، الجوع. نتمنى إنه توقف الحرب عن قريب جدا، لأنه الناس ما عاد عندها أي مجال للتحمل أبدا أبدا أبدا.
So we asked ourselves, what has life been like if you're a Palestinian teenager, say a 16-year-old, and you were born in Gaza? Well, at birth, an Israeli land, air, and sea blockade has affected every aspect of that child's life, from food to health to education. At the age of 2, he or she would have lived through 23 days of devastating air and ground attacks. Nearly 1,400 Palestinians were killed during Israel's Operation Cast Lead. 320 of them were children. In 2012, when that child was 5 years old, they would have survived an 8-day assault that killed more than 80 people, most of them women and children. At age 7, that child would have endured a 50-day Israeli onslaught. At least 2,310 Palestinians were killed back in 2014. 551 were children. Then as a preteen, he or she would have witnessed the aftermath of Israeli attacks that lasted 11 days. 260 Palestinians were killed, 67 were children. And now, another war on Gaza, this one far, far worse than any other. At age 16 today, an average Palestinian child is living through what's been described as genocide. 1 year of war in which more than 41,000 people have been killed, more than 16,000 of them children. We spoke earlier to Susan Harb. She was a well-being counselor at the British International School in Gaza, which is now entirely online after Israeli forces destroyed its building. Susan left Gaza back in November with her 5 children. She told us that she felt torn between keeping her family safe and wanting to remain in her homeland.
The infrastructure of Gaza itself as a city, every time they build it up, Israeli military make sure that they have to destroy it for people to go back to the level 0 again. But the thing that I saw over the last a year and a half, it was so amazingly that people are thriving to live. The resiliency of people were so high that you will not see it in any other household in the whole universe. People of Gaza want to live want to have a freedom, want to stay in Gaza. No one want to leave Gaza, no. Even us, even though with all the challenges that I met, I didn't want to leave Gaza. Surprisingly, when we had the chance to leave in the war, me and my older two girls, we were crying actually in the Rafah cross border, because I thought maybe I should stay. Why would I leave? Then I remember the last time I went to the supermarket in November, 2 days before we left, there was nothing in the shelves. And it was like a horror movie. And believe me, if I'm saying this was the first month of the war. So that was not a regular war. There is no equivalent between the power there. There was no shelters. There were no place to call safe place. This is where most of the people felt like we're not safe. And I felt if I have the chance to leave, to give someone else a chance to live, I'll leave. It's not that because, oh, people are running out of Gaza. No, actually, it's the quite opposite. No one I talk to from my friend or colleagues who left Gaza temporarily, they want to stay out. Everyone's saying, we want to go back, we want to rebuild it. But the challenges that I saw before, it's quite sad.
One of the demands that Hamas made in the early days of the war was the release of Palestinians from Israeli jails as part of an exchange deal. About 100 Israelis taken captive on October the 7th are still believed to be held in Gaza. For hundreds of Palestinians serving life sentences, a swap deal is their only way out of prison. Nida Ibrahim reports.
For many Palestinian families, the capture of dozens of Israelis on October the 7th revived the hope that had long been subdued. Prisoners exchange deals are the only way out of Israeli prisons for hundreds of Palestinians sentenced to life.
I have 4 sons serving life sentences, but I'm thinking about my son Nasser the most. He died in Israeli captivity in 2022. I hope to receive his body soon and bury him in the land he loved.
A hope put on hold. Negotiations between Israel and Hamas are at best dragging, with no sign of any breakthrough for now. Qatar and Egypt brokered a ceasefire in November that led to the release of dozens of Palestinian prisoners, women, children, and young men.
Our joy is not complete. We look at the sacrifices and blood spilled in Gaza. He's my eldest son. I am happy to see him here, but it's a painful moment.
At least 25 of those released have since been rearrested, including Omar's son, Mawad. Israeli forces killed 3 others during raids in the occupied West Bank. Israel says it returned 8 captives alive from Gaza. Dozens remain in Hamas captivity. Many are believed to be dead. This complicates any future exchange deal. Hamas insists on including high-profile prisoners like Marwan al-Barghouthi, Ibrahim Hamid, Abdullah al-Barghouthi, and Ahmed Saadat. Israel has repeatedly refused to release Palestinians charged with killing Israelis, including the now longest-serving prisoner in Israeli jails, Mohammed al-Tous. He spent 39 years behind bars and has been excluded from at least 4 swap deals.
Every time they announce there's an upcoming deal, I get anxious and worried. I won't believe it until I hold him in my arms and hug him.
His family says they never expected to wait this long. And as other families count the days towards when they might embrace their loved ones outside of Israeli jails, they say the passage of time has never felt heavier. Nida Ibrahim, Al Jazeera.
Mohammed Dahle is a human rights attorney who has practiced in Israeli and Palestinian legal systems for more than 30 years. We spoke to him earlier. At least 3,500 Palestinians are held under administrative detention in Israeli jails, meaning held without charge. And he explained how Israel uses this system of administrative detention.
It's an order issued by the military commander of the West Bank, an Israeli military official. And based on that military order, the Palestinian is being administratively detained, which means that there is no trial. The Palestinian who is detained on administrative detention doesn't know actually what is the charge and why he's being detained, and he doesn't have any access to any evidence that can be presented. And if he wants to try and challenge that, the only way to do that is through the Israeli courts. And in the Israeli courts, only the judges can see the evidence, while the detained and his or her lawyer cannot see any part, nor of the evidence or the charges themselves. And they can be detained for a long period of time. Some of the Palestinians who are administratively detained have been imprisoned for years now. So it's like usually for 6 months, but then it's being extended for another 6 months. And there is no judicial process through which the Palestinians can actually challenge that. It's a broad pretext of security reasons, and it's anything can be put under that title. But eventually, we don't know what it is actually. They say it's something that might happen in the future. That's what they claim. They say it's not a punishment for people, but rather trying to prevent them from doing acts in the future that would threaten the Israeli security or the security of the Israeli settlers in the occupied territories. But again, we don't know that. We don't know that as detainees. We don't know that as lawyers. And we are in a total, complete darkness as far as those detainees are related.
Palestine, the land of a people with a history that spans 4,000 years. A history rooted in rich traditions of trade, agriculture, industry, and art at the crossroads of Asia, Europe, and Africa. Its vibrant and prosperous cities, Jaffa, Safad, Akka, Haifa, were the heart of Palestine's thriving ports, factories, cinema, and theater. But in 1897, Zionism, an ideology born in Europe, sought to create a legally secure homeland for Jewish people in Palestine, threatening a millennia of multi-faith and multicultural Palestinian existence and identity. In 1917, during the First World War, the Imperial British government turned that Zionist aim into a reality by publicly pledging the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, an Arab land of strategic importance for the colonial power. The Balfour Declaration, as it is known, is condemned by Palestinians to this day as being immoral and illegal. In 1947, the United Nations weighed in, agreeing to split historic Palestine, which was under British mandate, into Jewish and Arab territories. Jerusalem was granted special international status. But that did not stop the Nakba, or the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, upon which the State of Israel was created and now stands. Between 1947 and 1949, Jewish paramilitary forces destroyed and captured almost 530 Palestinian villages and cities. More than 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their land. Neither they nor their descendants have been allowed to return to this day, in blatant disregard of international law. In 1967, Israel seized the rest of historic Palestine. It illegally occupies the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip through a system of discrimination and segregation, entrenching Jewish supremacy over Palestinian lives, a system that UN experts have called apartheid. And then came the Oslo Accords, described as Palestinian Versailles by renowned academic Edward Said, an agreement that gave Palestinians limited self-rule in parts of occupied West Bank, while Israel had total military control over the majority of the area. It imposed Israel's total security and economic control over Palestinian lives instead of resolving the fundamental question of Palestinian statehood and an end to Israel's illegal occupation. Today, that occupation is more entrenched and more violent. Today, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians continues in real time. Today, Israel is waging a war on Gaza that is unprecedented in its scale, its brutality, and devastation. Today, after 76 years of Nakba, Israel's genocide in Gaza unfolds before the eyes of the world, 365 days on. Avi Shleim joins us from Oxford in the UK. Sir, you're a historian, author of 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. And we wanted to talk to you today because you're not just any historian. In the 80s, you and a handful of others dug into Israeli government archives and classified documents, and you brought a new understanding of history to the public, specifically when it comes to the Nakba. Can you explain to our viewers, briefly if you could, what the official history was before and what your work revealed?
The official history about 1948 presents Israel as the victim. My colleagues and I, the new historians, Benny Morris, Ilan Pape, and myself, published books that amounted to a frontal attack on the Zionist version of the conflict. In particular, the Zionist version said that in 1948, the Palestinians left Palestine of their own accord or on orders from above. Benny Morris has demonstrated that the Palestinians did not leave, they were pushed out, that Israel carried out the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. Ilan Pape upended the Zionist version that towards the end of the mandate, Britain's aim was to abort the birth of a Jewish state. He showed that Britain's real aim was to abort the birth of a Palestinian state. And my own book, Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine, showed that the Arab coalition facing Israel was divided and that King Abdullah of Jordan had a tacit agreement with the Jewish agency to divide Palestine between themselves at the expense of the Palestinians. And as a result, the Palestinians were left out in the cold.
Initially, all of this work was not well received in Israel. What about now?
History was received with shock horror, and there was an attempt to discredit all of us. But gradually, some of the findings of the new history found their way into the intellectual mainstream. In particular, the notion that Israel was innocent of expelling Palestinians in 1948. Gradually, the new history helped to create a climate of opinion in Israel that was conducive to mutual understanding and to compromise. It helped to pave the way to the Oslo Accord. But after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, Israelis returned to fundamentalist positions of them and us, and now we've reached a stage of extreme division, extreme antagonism between Israel towards the Palestinians and the neighboring Arab states.
Why? You started to answer this question, Second Intifada. Why has the political discourse in Israel about Palestinians narrowed so much? There used to be different camps. You mentioned that. Pragmatic prime ministers who acknowledged that Israel would have to somehow deal with Palestinians, not just occupy them forever. And that no longer seems to exist.
The turning point was the collapse of the Camp David summit in the year 2000. Ehud Barak was largely responsible for the failure of that summit to resolve the conflict. He came back from Camp David and argued that there is no Palestinian partner for peace. This was not true. There was always a genuine Palestinian partner for peace, but the offer that Barak made to Yasser Arafat at Camp David was completely inadequate. It didn't meet the minimal Palestinian national demands. But the consequences of this claim were very considerable, because all Israelis believed Barak that there is no Palestinian partner for peace, and therefore you don't vote for a party that believes in negotiations. You vote for a strong man who is good at killing Arabs. Ariel Sharon fitted the bill. Ariel Sharon won the elections in 2001, and the Israeli right has been in power ever since. And Israeli society has been moving steadily to the right. And the present government, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, is the most right-wing, the most messianic, the most expansionist, the most aggressive, and the most Jewish supremacist government in Israel's entire history. And the result of having this messianic government in power is what we have seen, the tragedy of Gaza, and then the expansion of the war in Gaza to other fronts.
Avid Shleim, author, historian, thank you very much for joining us and for your contribution to this program today on Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories set the stage for armed resistance from groups such as Hamas. The movement traces its roots back to the late 1970s, originally as a charity that built schools, mosques, and clinics. Al Jazeera's Rory Challenge reports on the rise of armed groups and their tactics.
Terrorists or freedom fighters, legitimate resistance or murderous extremism. Armed Palestinian groups and the polarized language used to describe them have existed for as long as Palestine has been occupied.
To my mind, Palestinian armed resistance is integral to the Palestinian national struggle and has been integral to the Palestinian national struggle, going back more than 100 years to the beginning of the successive waves of Zionist migrations to what was then Palestine.
Palestinian resistance surged in the late 1960s, particularly after the Israeli occupation of Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The Palestine Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat nurtured many armed factions, such as the PFLP, which hijacked planes in the 1970s, and the Black September organization, which killed Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. And when the First Intifada started in 1987, and the stones of Palestinian youths were met with Israeli bullets, a new generation of groups emerged.
Before the First Intifada, certainly left-wing Palestinian political parties and armed groups dominated. After that, we start to see a rise in Palestinian Islamist groups. It was also, I think, to do with increasing perceptions that these left-wing and secular groups were corrupt and no longer had a viable strategy for Palestinian national liberation.
This was when Hamas ascended. While its military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, targeted Israeli civilians and soldiers with suicide attacks and rockets, Hamas also focused on politics. In 2006, it won elections in Gaza, then ousted the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority from the Strip, and used tunnels to keep fighting through Israel's Gaza wars of 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021. But Hamas methods have always stirred debate about the legality of armed resistance and how it should be conducted.
We can say the Palestinian people have a right to resist against Israel in the sense that their struggle against the occupant and the occupation is supported by international law. But the specific action of Hamas on 7 October are unlawful for the way in which they were undertaken.
But as ever, the appeal of such groups rises with increased Israeli oppression and when Palestinian hopes for sovereignty fall. Rory Challenge, Al Jazeera.
Yazid Sayer is a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center and author of Armed Struggle and the Search for State. You're joining us from London today, sir. Thank you for your time. There are plenty of people around the world who support Palestinian self-determination, but also cannot get behind attacks like October the 7th. How do you even begin to engage with these two ideas?
Well, for me, one of the very first thoughts I had and that I tried to communicate to people like my own kids was that it was entirely possible and right to be both opposed to what Hamas did on the 7th of October in terms of the deliberate slaughter of civilians, non-combatants in southern Israel, and at the same time demand freedom for Palestinians. I think it was a huge mistake that many fell into, that they had to somehow turn a blind eye to what Hamas had done. And I think that was fundamentally unnecessary and, of course, unethical. It was entirely possible, indeed necessary, to reconcile the two positions. They're both correct to be opposed to what Hamas did, but at the same time to be opposed to what Israel has done since then and had done for many years before to Palestinians, to Lebanese, and to others.
What is the track record of armed resistance in achieving self-determination? I mean, does it usually work?
That's a really broad question. Since the end of World War II and the era of decolonization, it's been clear that many armed struggles around what was then known as the Third World, the Global South, were instrumental in bringing about the end of colonial rule. This could even be said of India, for example, where we sort of exalt the position of Gandhi and nonviolence, but overlook the fact that crucial to the ultimate success of Gandhi's campaign was the fact that the British faced armed movements in India as well. So, often the armed resistance movements don't achieve military victories, but they eat away at the political will of the colonizing force, for instance, the United States and Indochina, and ultimately bring about a withdrawal. In the case of Israel and Palestine, things are different because comparing, for instance, to French occupation of Algeria, which lasted for a very long time, from 1830 until 1962, that's 132 years, the French colonialists ultimately did have a mother country they could retreat to, whereas when it comes to Israel, the idea that Jewish Israelis would just go back to where they came from, I think is no longer either, politically correct or ethically correct. And it does mean that Palestinians, I think, have always faced this dilemma of being clear that they had the right to resist occupation and dispossession and exile. But at the same time, I think they've never quite worked out how to address the Jewish Israeli population with ideas, political visions that both sides could buy into. It wasn't enough to say, we're offering you democracy or a secular state or a united state with equality for all citizens. That all sounds wonderful and I think comes from a good place. But if the other side doesn't accept that and become a partner in that, then how are you going to impose it? And you can't basically impose it. So I think these have been fundamental dilemmas facing the Palestinians from day one and still do.
Now, Israel says that it's going to defeat Hamas. Do you think that's even possible?
I think the real question here is Israel seeks to defeat the desire of people who define themselves as Palestinian, who live under Israeli control, with a direct military control in the West Bank, mixed control in East Jerusalem, indirect but also direct now military control in Gaza, and second-class citizenship inside Israel itself. The idea that these people will accept and become willing subjects in perpetuity to disenfranchisement, basic political rights, basic civil rights denied to them. This idea is ludicrous. And so it's not about whether Israel can destroy Hamas or not. It might do. But what does it do about 7 million Palestinians whose lives it controls in every possible way every day?
What does international law say about the right to resistance, and specifically when it comes to the Palestinians?
I'm not a legal expert. I can't quote, book and verse on this, but
do they have the right to resist is the question.
Well, the right to resist is absolute, I think, for everyone. The right to armed resistance is also something that I believe is enshrined in international law. But nonetheless, resistance should also observe and be bound by international humanitarian law and the laws of war, which means you don't kill unarmed prisoners, for instance, even soldiers. You don't kill civilians and so on. You don't use torture. You don't use starvation. All the sorts of things that Israel has been able to use for the last year. But Palestinians, and I think this is crucial and was on the 7th of October last year, that Palestinians too were bound and had to recognize that they were bound by the same laws that they seek to be applied in the case of Israeli action. And I think this goes back, but there's obviously a lot of political manipulation here and propaganda on both sides. I think back when I think of 7th of October, I'm reminded of Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon in 1982, who later became prime minister, one of the most hawkish right-wing politicians Israel's ever had. And in 1982, when he justified the Israeli invasion of Lebanon to destroy the PLO and destroy the roots of Palestinian nationalism, all of which failed, of course, his justification was that in the previous 13 years, the PLO had killed just over 1,200 Israelis and other nationals, of whom some 2/3 were military. So in terms of the normal way we think about things, it's clear that even according to Sharon, the PLO had actually targeted the military far more than it had targeted civilians. But here we have a situation where with Hamas on 7th of October, it reversed that almost exactly to something like 800 civilian dead and nearly 400 military dead on the Israeli side. But again, everyone is weaponizing these notions of international law, what it allows and doesn't. I fear we're now in a moment, we're witnessing the beginning of an era where the entire edifice of international law, laws of war set up over the past more than a century, I think that is fundamentally eroded. And I think that the lure of using artificial intelligence in war and what it allows is going to overwhelm the idea that the old laws still apply or can apply. And I think we're entering into a very dangerous new era on the legal front and not just on the military and humanitarian front.
Yazid Saïr, author of Armed Struggle and the Search for State. Thank you very much. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, Marwan Bashar. He's in London with us live, kicking off this week-long coverage of the one-year mark of the Gaza war. Marwan, in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th attacks, your fears for what might happen were among the most pessimistic that I heard at the time. And of course, when we look at it now, more than 40,000 people killed, Gaza broken, maybe beyond repair, the region descending into war, you weren't pessimistic, you were just right.
Well, it wasn't based on any instinct of sort, not even anchored in history. It was just seeing the case for genocide being manufactured each and every day between October 7 and October 19. You see, Cyril, if you remember, in October 12, within 12 hours, Hamas had shaken Israel. Israel was shook to the core. It was humiliated. It felt a major loss, not only because hundreds of its civilians were killed, but also because hundreds of its soldiers were killed and its military bases were violated. Its settlements, its villages were also run over by a movement that Israel long considered to be inferior to its mighty military. So after those 12 hours humiliated Israel, then we witnessed 12 days that basically went to shape the following 12 months. And during these 12 days, as I wrote, I think back in October 10, Israel and the United States began to manufacture the case for genocide. First, by demonizing Hamas as the ultimate terrorist organization of the 21st century. It's even worse than ISIS. It's even worse than Al-Qaeda. That to tackle it, it must be defeated just like ISIS was. And if anyone remembers what happened after 2014, especially 2017-18, they know the way it was handled, the countless deaths and so on and so forth. Of course, Hamas is nothing like ISIS. It's a national movement, and although it did carry terrorist attacks, it remains to be a national movement that seeks, as you spoke to your earlier guest, resistance and liberation of their homeland. But the demonization of not only Hamas, the demonization of Gaza as human animals, if you remember, also took charge, and Israelis became to demonize the entire Palestinian population there in preparation for basically bombing them, killing their children, bombing their hospitals, their schools, their residential buildings, and so on and so forth. And then what we saw by October 19, 12 days later, it was Biden, the American president, who capped it all at the White House when he tied in the question of Palestine to the question of Ukraine, saying Israel, like Ukraine, Palestine, like Russia, America needs to take charge along with Israel, contextualizing the question of Gaza with Ukraine and Taiwan, believe it or not, saying that Israel has every right, like Ukraine has every right. And hence, suddenly we had the case for genocide being defined by dehumanization, by political considerations of revenge and so on and so forth, as well as geopolitical calculus. That opened the way for an unraveling genocide that basically killed, as you stated, tens of thousands of people. And probably by the end of it, we're going to say that some 10% of the population in Gaza was either killed or injured.
So Marwan, you feared and you sensed that this was coming, and it did. Is there anything over the last 12 months that surprised you?
Well, I'm a student of international relations. I taught international relations for my students for many years, and I spoke on Al Jazeera for the past two dozen years. But it never really got to me. I taught it for years. I wrote about it for years. How, in the end of the day, international relations is about power. That imperial powers have one standard, not two standards, not double standards, power. And so I was taken aback throughout by something I taught a long time ago, but it never really sunk in. The silence, the deafening silence of Western powers, the deafening silence of Western governments, the Western silence, the silence of Arab governments, and to top it all, the silence of Western media. They are the ones with the eyes and ears. They're the ones who are supposed to be reporting. They're the ones who had the freedom to be able to report about such very important tragedies that were unraveling on our screens and other screens. But there was silence for many months while children were slaughtered, while hospitals were bombed. And that just goes a long way to tell you that while we as human society, we do think in terms of values, and we do things in terms of, we must reach out and we must have empathy, sympathy, and so on and so forth. But when it came to Gaza, whether it was a question of racism, or a question of imperialism, or a question of anti-Semitism, or whatever it is, right, there was deafening silence. So much so when I was covering on TV, like I am doing now, I was sometimes feeling myself screaming. Even I was reminded by our program, our editors, our colleagues, that, Marwan, why are you screaming? It's as if I wanted just to get a message through, because there was this major frustration that the world is watching, but it's not listening. The pain of the Palestinians as they die in their hundreds and thousands every week. And it just gone on for a year. Only much later on did some of them start catching up. But the majority, Western powers and Arab governments, they remain silent until today.
Al Jazeera's senior political editor. We'll talk again. Thank you very much.